After 4 intense years of the biggest war in America's history, the echoes of battle slowly hushed, and the dust from the Civil War began to settle. One thing became crystal clear: the Confederates had lost. People could finally evaluate the scale of the tragedy for the country. Cities in the South were in ruins, and a depressing truth emerged as 700,000 lives were lost. But there is still one urgent burning question: what to do with 300,000 rebels and a whole Congress of former enemies? Should you, as a winning side, strictly punish all of them for numerous war crimes? Or is there another solution for such a challenging question? When Ulysses Grant and Robert Lee met on April 9, 1865, at McLean's residence at Appomattox Courthouse to arrange terms for the surrender of Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, Lee had no idea what to expect. He had warned one of his soldiers just a few hours before that he would take the consequences for my actions. He could be arrested and taken to prison for all he knew. Lee was undoubtedly relieved when Grant drafted terms that included these provisions.
The officers to give their individual paroles not to take up arms against the government of the United States until properly exchanged. This done, each officer and man will be allowed to return to his home, not to be disturbed by United States authority.
In other words, this is the end. Go home and behave, and we won't bother you anymore. With the exception of the occupying Union forces stationed across the South for nearly a decade during Reconstruction, most common soldiers on both sides laid down their muskets and returned home. They were mostly farmers' sons. Therefore, they returned to their fathers' fields and assisted in the production of tobacco, cotton, or cows. Some helped rebuild the war-damaged or destroyed mills, bridges, tanneries, buildings, roads, and railroads. Along the railroads, new cities grew up, offering farmers' sons new chances in town. Some ex-soldiers relocated to Western territories. Let's dive into memories of a former regular Confederate soldier.
I owned a small farm, and indeed my family owned a group of slaves who were recently freed. Surprisingly, the freed slaves expressed a wish to stay with us. Opting for a fresh start, we made the decision to move to Texas. I, being married with 2 young children, went on the journey to Texas with our former family of slaves. They had 4 children. We worked together to construct 2 dog trot cabins, working side by side as former slave owners and former slaves, building a new life as neighbors.
Let's talk about the most important figures of the Civil War: General-in-Chief and President of the Confederate States, Robert Lee and Jefferson Davis. President Lincoln pardoned Robert Lee when he surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9, 1865. He was unable to return to his estate in Arlington, Virginia, because it had been turned into a national cemetery overlooking the graves of thousands of Union troops. Whatever happened, he didn't want to leave Virginia. "I cannot desert my native state in the hour of her adversity," he remarked to a friend. "I must abide her fortune and share her fate." Instead, Lee and his family relocated to Lexington, Virginia, where he became president of Washington College. It is said that he accepted this low-level position, which paid only $1,500 per year, because he felt it was unethical to benefit from such a brutal and bloody conflict. Washington College expanded physically and financially during the next 5 years, and Lee's personal connection with many of his students mirrored his goal to build a new generation of Americans. Lee signed an amnesty oath in 1865, hoping to become a citizen of the United States once again. He did so to actively persuade Confederate soldiers to rejoin the Union. Lee's wish to become an American citizen was destroyed by fate. His oath of allegiance was misplaced, and he died of heart failure on October 12, 1870, still considered just a guest in his own home country. Lee's oath was uncovered in the National Archives only 100 years later. Jefferson Davis and the remainder of the Confederate administration fled Richmond on April 2, 1865, as the Union Army moved on the Confederate capital. On May 10th, Union soldiers caught Davis in Irwinville, Georgia, and imprisoned him for 2 years at Fort Monroe in Virginia. Davis was indicted, but never tried for treason, and released on bond in May 1867. Davis's emotional and physical health had worsened while incarcerated. After spending 2 years traveling in Europe and working for a life insurance company, he and his family returned to Memphis, Tennessee. In 1876, they returned to the Mississippi Gulf Coast, where an admirer called Sarah Dorsey let them stay in a cabin on her seaside farm near Biloxi. Dorsey left her estate Beauvoir to Davis and his family when she died. He would spend the rest of his life there, eventually writing his experience of the war in a 2-volume book titled The Rise and Fall of the Confederate Government in 1881. Davis died in New Orleans in December 1889 from severe bronchitis. Davis's body was moved and reburied in Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond, the old Confederate capital, in 1893. Not every soldier and officer was lucky enough to start a new life as if nothing had happened. Some actions were unforgivable, and the hands of these individuals were already too deeply stained with blood. In early 1864, Henry Wirz was given command of the Andersonville prison, officially known as Camp Sumter. While both sides jailed convicts in terrible conditions, Andersonville deserves special recognition for the hellish conditions in which its prisoners were held. A stockade housed thousands of soldiers on a desolate, dirty area of land. A tiny stream ran through the camp, providing water for Union soldiers, but it quickly became a breeding ground for illnesses and human waste. Nearly 13,000 of the more than 45,000 prisoners transferred to Andersonville died there. After the war, Wirz was arrested in May 1865 and prosecuted by a military trial in August on allegations that he had conspired to injure the health and destroy the lives of soldiers in the military service of the United States. Wirz was court-martialed, found guilty on all counts, and given death penalty by hanging. Notorious guerrilla fighters faced the same fate. Samuel Champ Ferguson broke up his gang and went back to his farm at the end of the war. Upon hearing of his return, the Union soldiers captured him and brought him to Nashville, where a military court convicted him for 53 murders. Ferguson claimed to have killed over 100 people personally and admitted that his band had slain many of the victims listed. He said that this behavior was just a part of his soldiers' duties. Ferguson and his guerrilla group were known for their part in the Battle of Saltville, when they killed wounded Union soldiers and prisoners. The 5th United States Colored Cavalry, which was formed entirely of black soldiers, together with their white leaders, were the victims. Charges were made against Ferguson and his crew for killing victims with injuries while they were in hospital beds. The prisoners had nearly been massacred, only sparred by the entrance of Thomas's Legion of Cherokee Indians and Highlanders. Ferguson immediately took his soldiers and left after hearing that regular Confederates had arrived. For such crimes, he was court-martialed and hanged. Henry Magruder was found guilty on 17 charges of murder, wounding with intent to kill, and rape. The court also condemned him to death by hanging. The third hanged guerrilla is Marcellus Jerome Clark, who killed 3 soldiers, took 4 prisoners, and destroyed the burned railroad depot. Still, not every Confederate was prepared to accept that the war was coming to an end. Some troops chose to reject their commander's decision at Appomattox Courthouse and in the surrenders that followed, intending to enlist in another Confederate army. Rather than concede defeat, some of Kirby Smith's soldiers marched into Mexico after his eventual surrender. In the years that followed, many of these soldiers who had refused to accept surrender at the end of the war went on to oppose the federal government and formed paramilitary groups like the Ku Klux Klan during the Reconstruction era. Many nations made an effort to attract Southerners in the midst of the instability after the Civil War, mostly for political and agricultural motives. For instance, Mexico's Emperor Maximilian granted tax reductions and land. Land and tax benefits were also given by the Venezuelan government. Additionally, an Ottoman viceroy in Egypt recruited former Union and Confederate officers to assist in the invasion of Ethiopia. The Confederate ally Dom Pedro II of Brazil, who had provided Southern ships with supplies and shelter during the Civil War, offered the biggest benefits, though. He promised the Confederates speedy citizenship, paid for their transportation to Brazil, offered land to them for as cheap as 22 cents per acre, and occasionally even met them as they disembarked. Slavery was still legal at the time in Brazil, a country that had imported more slaves than the United States throughout the course of its history. Slavery was not prohibited there until 1888. Nevertheless, these American immigrants were never able to recreate the vast plantations that held slaves in the Deep South. Those who relocated to Brazil were not rich plantation owners. They were middle-class farmers, physicians, teachers, and machinists. They weren't die-hard slaveholders, and many belonged to families that had traditionally been pioneers on the frontier. Up to 3,500 Confederates lived in Municipality Americana and the surrounding areas during its peak of activity in the late 1800s. Though the group married and practiced interfaith marriage at first, the generations born in Brazil had a far higher chance of migrating to Brazil's cities or becoming more integrated into society overall.